million ahead of the numbers. Futures are off of the lows of the morning following strong sales from Walmart this morning. The quarter was better than expected on the earnings front, comp store sales front. As a result, that stock is doing well. And nonetheless, the Dow Industrials are still negative. The Dow futures down 62 points right now. The Nasdaq futures are up. They're up 2.25, and the S&P futures right now lower by 10 points. Those numbers usually not market movers, but we are certainly expecting the reopening to alleviate some stress. Let's get to Cheryl Casoni. She's got the numbers right now. Cheryl.
Yeah, 20% drop in building permits, Maria. Here are the estimates on the permit side, and these are future pieces of construction that we're talking about, plots of construction. It's 1.074. So that's right about in line on the estimates, just barely above it. But that's actually a pretty substantial loss from last month when it was 1.35 million permits. So 1.07 million permits. On the start side, this is the beginning of a homes construction site, if you will. 891,000. That is actually not as bad as we thought the drop was. Actually, it's worse than what we thought. We were expecting to see 927,000 starts coming in. We saw 891,000. Again, you got to do the month over month to kind of see what this really means, because in March, it was 1.22 million starts. So not a big surprise here. Obviously, this isn't going to be the home building sector, if we will, your KB Homes, your Pulte. These are the stocks to watch today. Futures Dow down 65 right now. But again, and we'd already heard from like the names of Pulte saying that they were doing furloughs, they were doing layoffs. So the industry itself was ready for this. The only bright spot in housing right now has got to be the 30-year fixed rate. I was just looking at the latest number, 3.52% on a 30-year fix. So if you could start construction on a new home, if you could buy something right now, the interest rate environment, very good for you. But again, that's what we're seeing on starts and permits. Not a surprise. Pressure on the industry, construction not happening. This is April. This is the month of the shutdown, Maria.
All right, Cheryl, thank you. And of course, we've been looking at which industries will get fired up first with this reopening. John Hilsenrath, construction was one of those industries that many people said they can start, they can reopen, get back to work. You can do the social distancing. You can do construction following all of the guidelines with a mask as well.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things happening in construction and housing. You know, one of the big problems in construction a few months ago was that there weren't enough workers. Well, sadly, it looks like there are going to be a lot of workers out there right now feeding that pipeline. You know, the other thing that Cheryl hit on, which I think is really important, is that interest rates are extraordinarily low. And, you know, in normal times, that should lead to a big housing upturn. There are a lot of housing shortages in a lot of cities around this country. The question is whether the banking industry is going to have the wherewithal to get that cheap credit out to individuals and out to the home builders. And, you know, the Fed is doing everything it can to pump that credit into the system. And we have to see if that's really going to support households with refinancing and new mortgages in the months ahead. But that could be a bright spot. It could be. We just have to see how we get through these next couple months of shock.
Yeah, it's a great point. Dagan.
Real estate is going to be more local than ever. Anecdotally, I've heard stories from people who are buying houses outside of New York to move and get out of Dodge, sight unseen. They have found them on the internet and have bought them like that. I know people who have listed their houses and literally sold them in a matter of days. That's what's happening. You could see a real rush out of these densely populated major metropolitan areas because of this virus, because people can't take it anymore.
Can I jump in there?
I think you're right, Dagan. I think cities are in big trouble. I think cities are in big trouble. People do not want density.
Can I jump back in there?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Don't count out New York. That's what I've got to say. You know, we've seen so many crises hit New York in the last 50 years. It almost went bankrupt in the 70s. We had 9/11. I've been talking to a lot of executives, including your friend Maria, Ken Langone, and like the message I'm getting from everyone is don't count out New York. It's going to have a hard time. There's no question. But, you know, New York survived cholera outbreaks in the 1800s, the Spanish flu in the early 1900s. I'm not counting the place out.
Yeah, but I'm not hanging around for 120 years. New York, it was already bad because of the bail reform, because you have a mayor who is completely incompetent. I want to point out that Mayor de Blasio just spent $2 million on new hires and pay hikes, and that he's focused on erecting fencing on beaches to keep people from going into the water over Memorial Day weekend. Come on. People, listen, they're not going to wait around on my show. They're not going to wait around to have their apartment broken into. And they're not, you know what?
He said that Sunday. He said that Sunday. He said the beaches are not ready to be open in New York City. We will not open them. We are so far away from a reopening. He said on Sunday Morning Futures with me, and he said, yes, I will put fencing around if they go into the water. That's what he's saying. And he also said that he needs $7.5 billion, John. He says that he wants the federal government to make it whole.
So that's why he's not going to get money from the federal government if he is basically passing along 7-figure pay hikes and additional hires. Number one. Number two, why do people pay $5,000 for a 500 square foot apartment in a not great neighborhood in New York City? It's because of everything that goes on outside of your apartment. It is the theater. It is music. It is bars. It is nightlife. It is culture. It is museums. When's all that coming back? The theaters in Broadway are shut down until the fall. People are not going to wait around for that unless they get dramatic rent decreases, and the landlords have their heels dug in.
I get all that. New York is bigger than one person and one mayor. It's been through bad mayors before, and it's been through tough times. It's been through pandemics and epidemics. You know, yeah, it's going to be a very hard time, and all that stuff needs to reopen. But don't count out New York. It's got 400 years of history, and it's grown through a lot of bad times. That's all I'm going to say is don't count the place out. I understand what you're saying about Broadway and theater and restaurants. They'll come back eventually.
I'm not counting the people. Listen, New Yorkers are awesome. I'm a Southerner by birth. I'm a Southerner by birth and a New Yorker by choice. I love the people here, but there are a lot of folks who grew up here during the 70s who are not going to wait around for those days to come back. And there's no hope in sight with that mayor running the city.
I mean, I'm putting the coronavirus aside for right now because, yes, you've had all of this impact from the coronavirus, but things were turning negative in New York way before the coronavirus. Mattie, let's talk about the number of people fleeing New York because of higher taxes, because of the homelessness. And of course, yes, then there's that bail reform law, which allowed all of these inmates out on the street. Then what did they do? They came out, they started committing more crimes, and then they had to be put back in. But there are all of these other inmates out because they're trying to cut down the capacity of Rikers Island. So New York was in big trouble before the coronavirus.
Listen, the IRS tracks data of taxpayers who flee high tax states for lower tax states, and the trend line is not good for New York. We consistently see the people who, by the way, are the ones who are funding all of those public edifices that Dagan just mentioned. Those people are fleeing. They're not putting up with it anymore. They don't want to be the last remaining pieces of the tax base, while the rest of the people who live in New York try to find other places where they can be more productive and where their income isn't being confiscated by an incompetent public space. So I think that you're right, Maria. It is not simply just the question of the coronavirus. Listen, I live in a city too. I live in D.C. I love D.C., but there are problems with living in a city when you have a pandemic that shuts down everything in the city that makes it worth paying the high cost of living there. So, you know, New York is one of the places that certainly comes to mind. Look at the Pelosi bill that was just passed in the House. SALT deduction back on the table for high income earners because some people are saying that they feel the pinch of those high state and local taxes. They want to be able to deduct them rather than forcing their state and local politicians to make harder choices.
Absolutely.
Are any of you moving out to the country permanently? Any of you?
I get up at 2. Well, you know what? I actually did live in the country for some years. I lived in the country for some years, and I get up at 2 o'clock in the morning. So I was getting up at 12:30 at night, so I didn't commute. I'm not commuting anymore for that reason.
Some of us aren't willing to buy a house online. Dagan's got friends who are braver than I am. I think the real question is what this does for that residential industry. You know, a lot of places have tried to do online tours, you know, make this an accessible industry while the pandemic's going on. I'm not willing to buy a house sight unseen, but some people may be.
I know people who have done it.
We want to, yeah.
I'm talking to some people who are talking about moving into the city because they don't want to commute anymore. So, listen, it's going to be a very dark and hard time.
I'll sell them my house. Listen, John, I'll sell them my house right now. If they don't want to do a commute anymore and I can get further away, let's make a deal.